Two ambitious women, one shot outside an apartment building.
They both had overcome a lot to try to be successful.
She was very loving. Whatever you would need, she was more than happy to give it to you.
Witness accounts describe an escalating drama, but reports of what happened depend on who's telling the story.
There was a brief, some disagreement.
A group of girls had jumped one female.
She pulled what seemed to be like a small handgun and shot.
She had no criminal record. The first time her name had came up in any situation.
The aggression, the beat down, that would make anybody afraid.
I was thinking to myself, this could be what triggered everything.
She showed her the small knife and said that she would use it to protect herself.
And she claimed she had this gun for protection. You had supporters for both. I think it created a divide in the city, but she didn't deserve to die that way.
June 26th, 2011. It's a quiet Sunday afternoon in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, when a series of urgent calls come into the Jefferson County 911 Center.
911.
Somebody just got shot in Sunset Village.
Ma'am?
Somebody just got shot in Sunset.
The calls were coming in saying that they had a shooter. They heard gunfire. People was running. It was a bunch of chaos. And they knew that one person had been shot.
So now please come to his apartment this Sunset. Please, this girl got shot in her chest.
Okay, it's a female that's shot in her chest.
Yes.
First responders are dispatched to a location on the west side of town.
When responding to those type calls, it's always in the back of your mind, is the shooter still there?
The first officer on the scene sees an older man administering CPR to the apparent victim. The man says he is a reverend at the church across the street.
He saw the confrontation and heard the shots. Shots really got his attention.
Looked over and he basically sees another woman with a gun and he sees a woman lying on the ground. So he goes over to render aid. When I arrived, the scene was secure. EMT was giving attention to the young lady that was down. You could see the blood coming out of the shoulder area. She was not conscious. She was not talking. They was rendering aid and getting ready to load her up into the ambulance.
As the victim is rushed to the hospital, police question bystanders to find out who she is.
We identified her through witnesses that had given her name as Vanessa Bearden.
They were able to determine that she didn't live there. So part of their initial inquiry was to determine why she was there.
The average citizen in Pine Bluff is not likely to be a victim of some random act of violence. We don't have home invasions with killing, drive-bys, and when we do, it's personal beef. It's not random.
Vanessa Bearden had no criminal record, no run-ins with the law. So you want to know who, what, why, and how. Just how all of this materialized.
Born May 15th, 1990 in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, Vanessa Bearden has deep ties to the community.
Growing up, Vanessa, she had a lot of love. She was surrounded by all her cousins and all her family.
They're a big family, and they're a Pine Bluff family. They are known for their church affiliations, singing group, the Bearden Singers.
We were country kids, so we like to ride four-wheelers. We're outside picking getting the eggs from the chickens, just running around.
Everybody knew Vanessa, and she just had a really big personality.
Vanessa was very loving. Whatever you would need, if you would ask Vanessa, Vanessa was more than happy to help you with it or give it to you.
She sought justice. She wanted to make sure that everybody was treated the right way, treated fairly.
In 2008, around the time Vanessa turned 18, the Bearden family faced a major challenge.
Vanessa's father had been sick for a little bit, but when he passed away, it was still a very big shock to our family, especially to Vanessa. It was part of her support system that was no longer there, that was gone. I think it caused her to kind of reevaluate a little, take some things more seriously.
She did grow. She became more mature. Vanessa did step up with helping me as well. So she would keep my children while I worked. That was about the same time where she met the father of her children and began a relationship with him. And she had 2 kids. Vanessa's mom is a nurse. A lot of our family, they are nurses. And she liked to care for people. So Vanessa wanted to go on to become a nurse. I think it probably made her a little bit sad her dad wasn't there to see that happen. Vanessa was the best mom ever.
Their hair, shoes, everything was planned, everything was intentional because she loved those babies, and that was the way she showed her love.
As happy as 19-year-old Vanessa was to be a mother, the hardships continued when her relationship with the father of her children ended.
She did try to make that relationship work, but when she realized that it was not salvageable, that's when she kind of decided to explore other options outside of him.
Within the same year, her mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer.
Vanessa took that very hard because her mom is her idol. She was modeling her life, her adult life, after her mother's life.
Her mother's battle inspired Vanessa to complete her training to become a certified nursing assistant as she raised her nearly 2-year-old daughter and 6-month-old son.
She had just starting her job so that she could continue taking care of her family. And, you know, she had a lot of positive things working out for her right then.
But just as 21-year-old Vanessa's hard work is paying off, a tragic shooting has left her gravely wounded. And Pine Bluff police are trying to determine what happened.
They were able to piece together the approximate area in which the shooting took place, and that was based on them locating a spent 9mm cartridge.
We also retrieved the knife that was on Vanessa Bearden's person. The Reverend had taken it and given it to us. There wasn't any blood on it. I was wondering to myself, did she bring this knife to this scene with the intentions of using it? And it went bad?
As they begin to talk to people, they start getting into more specific questions.
According to some, it might have been related to a fight that took place 45 minutes earlier at a different apartment complex a few blocks away.
It was a group of college-age girls had jumped one female. And then you had a crowd of onlookers watching the fight.
They say Vanessa Bearden was one of the girls in that group and one of several people who recorded the fight.
I was thinking to myself, okay, she was involved in this fight. This could be what triggered everything. You want to know who, what, why, and how. So I want to know, did they know each other? What was the cause of the shooting? Was this a planned attack, or was she just in the wrong place at the wrong time?
Coming up, an eyewitness shares her version of the story.
She wrote her window down and told us, "You bitches come see me."
and the suspect tells her own.
She had been jumped, and she was just trying to protect herself from this group of girls.
Detectives in Pine Bluff, Arkansas are investigating the shooting of 21-year-old Vanessa Bearden. And news of the tragedy has started to spread through the community.
Another cousin called me and he asked me, did I hear anything about Vanessa being shot? And I told him no. So we all went to the hospital. We all met at the hospital. I remember sitting in the family room and the clergyman coming to pray with us. She's the baby cousin, and it's just not how it's supposed to go.
At the scene, investigators have just learned about a fight between a group of women about 45 minutes before the shooting at another complex nearby. A young woman named Colby steps forward and tells them she knows who shot Vanessa.
She identified herself and that Vanessa was a friend of hers. She said they witnessed the fight and partook in it.
Colby agrees to come to the police station and give a formal statement.
Could you tell me what happened today?
Before that incident happened, Vanessa Bearden was involved in an incident with Olivia Moody.
Colby says Olivia isn't someone she and Vanessa knew well, but she was involved in an argument with their friend named Alicia, who lives nearby.
She said that early in the day she was hanging out with Vanessa, and they noticed another friend of theirs, Alicia Jeffries, was involved in a fight with another young lady.
There was some disagreement between Alicia and Olivia. There were witnesses who tried to break up the fight, but it had almost that gang element of multiple girls jumping on one.
I have been knowing Olivia for probably 4 months, but I haven't known her well as friends. I've always known her to stay into it with people, saying something smart just to see if someone would come bother her. And today she got to fighting one girl, and Vanessa jumped in that fight.
So Vanessa jumped in the fight against Olivia?
Yes, which doesn't make sense to me because they don't even know each other.
A young man that they called Casey, he pulled Olivia from the fight.
That fight was broken up by a black male, and the black male dropped Olivia off in Sunset.
As he's removing Olivia, she is screaming obscenities. She is screaming threats at the group.
After the incident, Colby says Alicia went home and she and Vanessa continued on with their day.
According to Colby, about 45 minutes after the fight, her and Vanessa was hanging out actually at the apartment complex where Olivia Moody lived. They were sitting on a fence post in front of the building, and they noticed a white Tahoe riding through, and Olivia Moody was actually in that Tahoe.
They came past us as me, Vanessa, and a group of other girls and males were standing along a ledge. And Olivia rolled her window down and told us, "You bitches come see me."
Colby says they shrugged it off, but a little while later, Olivia sent them another message directed specifically at Vanessa.
A young boy, probably 8 or 9, he came through the hallway of one apartment complex and said that Olivia said she wanted the girl in the red shorts. Vanessa was the only one in red shorts. I stated to Vanessa, don't go, because I knew she had a gun.
How did you know she had a gun?
I was just saying because the type of person she seems to be, she wouldn't just call you out of a fight. So Vanessa reached to her side and tapped on her side and showed me a knife and said she not playing with her.
Colby said that she showed her the small knife that she had and said that she would use it to protect herself if she needed to.
Colby says Vanessa went to find Olivia and the rest of the group followed her.
Vanessa started to go through the same apartment building hall that the boy came out of. She got within 4 or 5 feet of the apartment, and I saw Olivia reach out from behind her pants and pull what seemed to be like a small handgun. It was silver. And she pointed up her gun and shot. And when I saw that, I ran. And when I ran, I didn't know Vanessa had been hit until I heard her yell, "Colby, I'm hit." I turned around and I started running back. I saw a man, an older man, bent over, giving Vanessa CPR.
Okay. Did Vanessa have the knife out at the time she was shot?
No, sir. The knife was never drawn.
In my opinion, Colby was believable. I believe the way she painted the picture and how everything went down.
The young man that Olivia Moody sent through that breezeway to try to make contact with those 3 young ladies was never identified. We're not able to determine who it was. Once law enforcement spoke with Colby, they had additional investigative steps. They wanted to see if they could find additional witnesses that could support the story that Colby just told them, and they want to find Olivia Moody.
Before investigators can follow up with anyone else, they receive devastating news about Vanessa.
She was pronounced dead at the hospital.
After hearing that she had succumbed to the wounds, this changed the whole dynamic of the crime scene. So now we don't just have a first-degree battery, now we have a homicide.
News of the fatal shooting of 21-year-old Vanessa Bearden has shaken the community of Pine Bluff, Arkansas. Family members gather at the hospital in mourning.
When I found out she died, it hurt me. It hurt me deeply. And I hurt for my aunt, and I hurt for my cousins, because she played an integral part in their life.
I was shocked when it happened because she's the baby cousin. I knew how much we were losing. And to us, she was not just another girl that got shot. When we went back to see her, they asked us not to touch her because it was a crime scene. And I think that had to be the hardest part for her mom and her sister.
As Vanessa's loved ones try to make sense of the loss, detectives are following up on a suspect in the shooting. 20-year-old Olivia Moody.
We come into the knowledge that she lives in Sunset Village, so we was able to track her down there. We found no weapon at the scene, so we wasn't ruling out the fact that she may still be armed. We knock on the door and she answers.
They obtained consent from Olivia to search her apartment. During the course of that search, they were not able to locate or did not locate the firearm that Olivia used to shoot Vanessa Bearden.
We take Olivia back to the detective office, back to the station where she's Mirandized, and we talk to her further from there. Her demeanor was, I would say, calm, nonchalant. She admitted to the shooting, but she's saying that it was self-defense.
Olivia confirms what Vanessa's friend Colby told police, that she was involved in an argument earlier that day with Alicia Jeffries.
We find out this revolved around the fact that Alicia was now dating a young man that Olivia Moody used to date. And apparently that caused some friction between Olivia Moody and Alicia. They had come in contact as Olivia Moody was walking down the street.
Olivia stated that Alicia and some of her friends, one of them being Vanessa Bearden, they colluded together to jump her and beat her until she was able to get out of their grasp.
We took photographs of Olivia's face, of her hands.
She did sustain some evidence of physical injury, abrasions, cuts.
Olivia says it might have been worse if her friend KC hadn't stepped in to save her.
Brian Gaddy was a friend of Olivia's. They called him KC. He was the guy that got her out of the fight. He was trying to break the fight up and get her out of harm's way.
After leaving the apartments, Olivia says she obtained a gun in case she had any more run-ins with the women.
Olivia claimed she had this gun for protection, and she was headed back to her apartment. And on the way there, she see the group of girls sitting on the fence post by her apartment.
Although Alicia had already left the apartment complex, that group did include Vanessa and Colby. Near them was a group of young men, and Olivia says one of them approached her, a man known as G-Rel.
G-Rel had some prior minimal association with Olivia Moody. In other words, they knew each other, but they weren't friends.
Olivia says G-Rel asked her about the fight, and as they talked, she decided it might be worth trying to de-escalate the tension through some of her friends.
She decided, according to her, to go talk to Vanessa and Colby to see if she could, I believe the phrase she used was squash the situation.
Olivia admits she brought a gun with her just in case.
Olivia says she had been jumped, she's been harassed, and she's been bullied. She was just trying to protect herself from this group of girls.
As Vanessa and Colby got closer, Olivia claims she heard Colby say, "Get her."
So she pulls out the gun, according to Olivia, to scare him.
She admits that she shot the gun in the direction of Vanessa Bearden. But Olivia claimed that she was trying to shoot a warning shot.
When she realized she'd actually shot Vanessa, she was in shock.
She just stood there near the body, and someone took the gun from her. She didn't notice who took it. Then she went to her apartment, closed the door, and waited for the authorities.
After hearing Olivia's version, I didn't buy the warning shot based on witnesses' statement that it was pointed at Vanessa.
After her interview, the decision is made to arrest Olivia.
Miss Moody was initially charged with capital murder. As I was filling out paperwork and the ticket to let Miss Moody know she was being charged with capital murder, she made the statement, no, actually it was second-degree murder. It caught me by surprise because I had never heard anyone make a statement like that.
While Olivia's comment reveals unexpected knowledge of the legal system, it has no effect on the outcome.
When there is a criminal charge, an arrest charge is called, that's made by the police. But the police aren't authorized to file an official criminal charge, an indictment. And in court, she was charged with murder 1.
At this point, you want to find more witnesses to either debunk or solidify her statement. We was trying to collaborate the story that Olivia told us about G-Rail being at the scene, but we was unable to locate him. I was beginning to wonder if there was a G-Rail.
Coming up, investigators question their assumptions about Olivia.
She does not fit the profile of a cold-blooded killer.
And the residents of Pine Bluff begin to take sides.
The community stood behind Olivia, believed in her.
It kind of felt like being victimized all over again.
Just a few hours after the death of Vanessa Bearden, the young woman who shot her, Olivia Moody, is in police custody. Investigators suspect her claim of self-defense is a smokescreen for her true motive.
I think to a large degree that Olivia Moody had been embarrassed and she had been punked down, and that she was going to take action to make sure that everybody in that area knew she was not to be messed with.
Kobe had told us that the fight earlier during the day was between Alicia Jeffries and Olivia Moody. So now we need to talk to Alicia to find out what the fight was about.
When detectives speak with Alicia, she confirms she and Olivia are at odds over a guy, but she does not agree to a formal interview. To learn more about their issues, detectives dig into their social media.
They did not like each other. They had a pretty significant Facebook war in which they both said very terrible things about the other person. And that all surrounded by what was then Olivia Moody's ex-boyfriend and Alicia's current boyfriend.
Alicia started taunting and harassing Olivia, and tensions became high and it escalated into the fight.
A background check on Olivia Moody underscores the tragedy of the shooting.
Olivia Moody, she was born in Chicago, Illinois, came up poor. Her mother was addicted to drugs.
Olivia's mother let her family members raise her children as she worked on her recovery.
Olivia's mother is my sister, and in the beginning, me and my mom, we were taking care of my sister's 5 kids, and Olivia was one of them. And eventually, my mom lost her eyesight, so I ended up getting all the kids through DCSF and my mom, and it wasn't easy, but we made it. We made it.
Despite the hardships of her early childhood, Olivia managed to rise above her circumstances.
Olivia was very bright. She was a honor roll student in elementary school. She was always studious, and she was very giving. She was basically just a good kid. She didn't get in trouble. She went to school every day. She made good grades.
She ended up coming to Pine Bluff, attending University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff, and majoring in criminal justice.
She would have been the first person in my immediate family that would have graduated with a college degree. So, yeah, we was all proud of Olivia.
At the time, she was actually a clerk for a local circuit judge. Knowing Olivia's background, she does not fit the profile of a cold-blooded killer.
Detectives consider the possibility that Olivia has been telling them the truth about being harassed. But they need to determine why Vanessa was the one who ended up dead. Searching for clarity, they revisit the witness statements and discover a pivotal piece of evidence.
Vanessa and Olivia didn't have any type of relationship. They didn't even know each other prior to that day.
Vanessa did, however, video that altercation with her cell phone.
The video of the fight, it shows all the people that was around watching it, and it shows Olivia getting jumped on. She's pretty much helpless, and it's hard to fight against that many attackers. I believe that Vanessa was at the wrong place at the wrong time. Vanessa wasn't the one that Olivia was into it with. She just happened to be there. But I think seeing those girls that had jumped on her, I think it triggered something in Olivia. But I feel like there was other avenues that Olivia could have taken before taking matters into her own hand.
Although Olivia Moody has been charged with the first-degree murder of Vanessa Bearden, investigators now question whether the evidence supports her claim of self-defense. They hope the results of an autopsy will provide some definitive answers.
Vanessa's autopsy revealed that she was struck in her back left shoulder, and it actually exited through the front out of her right shoulder.
She was shot in the back.
It was not a close range gunfire, somewhere between 6 to 10 feet maybe. I'm thinking, it's not self-defense if you hit in the back and you also flee. See, if Vanessa had pulled the knife on her or tried to cut her or stab her, then you would have had an argument for self-defense.
It's important to note that there's no evidence that Vanessa Bearden ever brandished the knife, much less threatened Olivia Moody with the knife.
As the story of Vanessa's murder and Olivia's arrest spreads through the community, not everyone agrees about Olivia's guilt.
I think it created a divide in the city because you had supporters for both, and you had a lot of anti-bullying sentiments that was brought about for Olivia, and had people that felt like Vanessa didn't deserve to die that way.
Olivia got to be the person that they looked at and said, oh, well, just because she went to college, it couldn't have been Olivia that did it. Vanessa had to have done something in order for Olivia to react like that. And it kind of felt like being victimized all over again.
Olivia returns to college while investigators continue to build their case against her. Then, 3 months after Vanessa Bearden's death, a new witness emerges.
An individual by the name of Gerald Allen, or Gerald Allen. He goes by the street name G-Rail.
Olivia claimed this man witnessed the shooting firsthand, but police had never been able to find him.
G-Rail, the one we was looking for, he surfaced. He's locked up in jail on drug charges.
While he's incarcerated awaiting trial, he writes a letter to the prosecutor's office indicating that he has information. That letter's turned over to the Palmer Police Department investigators, and they go interview Gerald Allen. G-Rail was a material witness for the government. This case was heavily dependent on eyewitness testimony as to what happened.
G-Rail says that he sees Olivia shortly after the fight.
Olivia entices G-Rail to try to talk to those three girls and get them to come have some type of interaction with her.
Later on, G-Rail said he sees Olivia fires a shot from about 6 to 10 feet away, striking Vanessa. He also mentioned that Vanessa never made any type of threatening moves towards Olivia.
G-Rail did confirm that Olivia Moody shot Vanessa Bearden in the back, not only in the back, but as Vanessa Bearden was running away from Olivia Moody. However,
He seems just as conflicted about the shooting as the community at large.
G-Rail still believes that despite all that information, despite how everything played out, that Olivia still acted in self-defense.
He maintained that, but he was incorrect.
For prosecutors, the statement makes one thing abundantly clear.
I have never believed that Olivia Moody was an inherently bad person. I believe Olivia Moody did an inherently bad thing.
I honestly believe she got the gun for protection, but I think just seeing them at her place where she resided triggered something in her. I think she tried to bait them into that situation. I don't believe she fired a warning shot. I think she just pointed and fired.
But they know the outcome of any trial, especially one this controversial, is uncertain.
Going into trial, I had my concerns about the public opinions because you don't know how that would affect the jury.
Nearly 1 year after Vanessa Bearden's death, the young woman who shot her, Olivia Moody, goes on trial for murder.
The trial began May 16, 2012, and the courtroom is packed. There's a lot of supporters there for Olivia. There's some supporters there for Vanessa.
Our defense was self-defense. We tried to use the aggression, the beat down, that would make anybody afraid. She was protecting herself against further beat down.
General argument by the prosecution is that it can't be self-defense if the victim is fleeing and is no longer a threat to you.
You have to prove state of mind in order to say you fearfully of your life. And the only way we could establish that was to put her on the stand. But anytime you put a criminal defendant on the stand, it is just high risk.
Before Olivia takes the stand, prosecutors attempt to negotiate a plea deal, reducing the charges from first-degree murder to manslaughter. But Olivia refuses the deal.
She would have gotten 4 years probation, reduced to manslaughter, with the right of expungement of record. Had that happened, she would have been placed in a car that day with her family going back to Chicago.
Olivia Moody took the stand. She was faced with tough questions that she did not have an answer for. Why she got a gun, why she went to them. And then the defense was done presenting their evidence, and we gave closing statements. But the jury deliberated and came back with a verdict of guilty on one count of second-degree murder. I believe it was very clear to the jury that this was not a case of self-defense. Not at all. This was an extreme manifestation in indifference to the value of human life, which is what second-degree murder is.
The verdict was very hard. It was very hard. Olivia was very strong. She didn't cry, you know. She was trying to comfort us, matter of fact.
The guilty verdict felt like not what we believed she deserved, but there was some kind of justice.
She received 30 years and was eligible for parole and 7.5 years with good behavior. I felt like justice was served, but in the end, you had 2 families destroyed. Vanessa and Olivia, they both come from rough backgrounds. They both had overcome a lot to try to be successful. They both had bright futures ahead of them. And this situation just changed the trajectory of their both futures.
We talk about Vanessa pretty often, remembering the good things, laughing about the things that were funny, and telling the stories, making sure that her children are brought up in an environment of love.
Vanessa was a person that never got to live up to her potential. A lot of times when I have seen interviews or even while I was in court, she was always referred to as that girl. But she's Vanessa to us. She's a mom. She's a sister. She's a daughter. She belongs to somebody. She's still here with us. She's still a person. We still believe that Vanessa should have been able to live her life peacefully.
In October 2024, a sense of fear spread across parts of Ontario as police officers in different communities found themselves investigating what appeared to be a rapidly unfolding nightmare. Within only a few days, 3 people were dead. The locations were separated by distance, the circumstances were still unclear, and investigators were faced with a question that no community wants to ask. Was someone moving from one place to another, leaving behind a trail of violence? The name that would soon become connected to the investigation was Sabrina Kaldhar. At first, the events appeared to be separate tragedies. A death reported in Toronto, another discovery in the Niagara region, then another case emerging in Hamilton. Different streets, different communities, different scenes. But as detectives began placing the pieces together, a disturbing pattern started to appear. The timeline was what made this case different. In many homicide investigations, detectives have time. They can slowly examine relationships, search for conflicts, analyze motives, and build a picture of what happened. They can look back at weeks, months, sometimes years of history between a victim and a suspect. But this investigation moved with a different kind of urgency. The distance between each incident was short. The clock was moving, and authorities had to consider the possibility that the person responsible might not stop. 3 lives were suddenly gone. Behind every headline and every police statement were people who had families, routines, memories, and futures that disappeared without warning. To the public, the case became a shocking story about an alleged killer moving through Ontario. But for those who knew the victims, it was something much more painful: an impossible phone call, an empty chair, a life interrupted. As investigators worked across multiple jurisdictions, they faced the challenge of connecting events that happened in different places. Toronto police, Niagara investigators, and Hamilton authorities all had pieces of a much larger puzzle. Every detail mattered. Every witness statement, every piece of evidence, every moment on the timeline could determine whether these incidents were connected or simply tragic coincidences. The description that began appearing was one that carries enormous weight: a possible serial killer. That term is not used lightly. It suggests a pattern of separate acts of violence, committed at different times or locations, with connections that investigators must carefully prove. In the case involving Sabrina Kaldhar, police believe the circumstances showed signs of a person allegedly responsible for multiple deaths in a short period. But behind that label was a deeper mystery. Why these victims? What connected them, if anything? Was there a motive hidden beneath the surface? Or were investigators looking at a series of events driven by a complicated and unpredictable chain of decisions? As police began their investigation, the communities surrounding these cases were left searching for answers. Neighbors who had once felt safe in familiar streets began looking differently at the world around them. Ordinary places suddenly became linked to something terrifying. A road traveled every day, a neighborhood known for its quiet routines, a community where people expected normal life to continue. Instead, those places became part of a story that shocked the province. The investigation into Sabrina Kaldhar would become one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Canada in 2024, not only because of the number of alleged victims, but because of how quickly everything unfolded. The idea that 3 deaths could occur within such a short time frame created a sense of urgency and confusion. For detectives, the mission was clear: reconstruct the final moments of those who died, understand the movements of the accused, and uncover the truth hidden between 3 locations. For the families, there was a different reality. They were not waiting for a mystery to be solved for the sake of a new story. They were waiting for answers about someone they loved. They were trying to understand how a normal day became the last day. They were facing the kind of grief that does not arrive slowly, but crashes into a person's life without warning. Every investigation begins with questions, but some investigations begin with fear. The case surrounding Sabrina Kaldhar began with both. As officers gathered evidence and searched for connections between Toronto, Niagara, and Hamilton, the story that emerged was not just about an accused individual. It was about 3 people whose lives ended, 3 families changed forever, and a chain of events that forced an entire region to ask how something so devastating could happen in such a short amount of time. This is the story of the investigation into the alleged crimes of Sabrina Kaldhar, a case that would leave Ontario searching for answers and trying to understand the events of those few unforgettable days in 2024. Ontario is a place where the landscape changes quickly. From the crowded streets of Toronto, where millions of people move through the city every day, to the quieter communities of the Niagara region and Hamilton, each area has its own rhythm, its own identity, and its own sense of safety. These are places where people go to work, raise families, meet friends, and live ordinary lives. That sense of normal life is what made the events of October 2024 so unsettling. The first reports did not arrive as one massive crime story. They came separately, through different police departments, through different emergency calls, and through different scenes that at first appeared to belong to their own individual tragedies. But as investigators began looking deeper, the lines between those cases started to become impossible to ignore. Toronto became the starting point of an investigation that would eventually spread across the region. When police officers respond to a death, their first responsibility is to understand what happened. They examine the scene, collect information, speak with witnesses, and try to reconstruct the final moments of a person's life. In those early hours, investigators often do not have the full picture. They have fragments, a location, a timeline, a name, small details that may or may not become important later. But in this case, the details began creating a larger image. The discovery that another death had occurred outside Toronto changed the direction of the investigation. What initially looked like a single incident began to raise questions about a possible connection. Then another location entered the picture, Hamilton. 3 communities, 3 victims, a short period of time. For investigators, geography became an important part of understanding the case. A person traveling between different areas could create a challenge unlike a traditional homicide investigation. Different police services had to communicate. Information had to move quickly. Detectives needed to compare evidence and determine whether they were looking at separate crimes or one continuous pattern. The fear was not only about what had already happened, it was about what could happen next. When a violent crime occurs, communities often try to make sense of it by searching for familiar explanations. People ask whether the victim knew the person responsible. They ask whether there was a warning sign, a conflict, a moment that could have predicted what was coming. But when the details remain unclear, fear fills the empty spaces. Residents in the affected areas were left wondering how 3 separate deaths could happen, so close together. The idea that someone could move between communities while investigators were still trying to understand the first incident created a sense of urgency. Police were not only investigating the past, they were trying to prevent the future. The woman at the center of the investigation was Sabrina Kaldhar. As authorities began announcing the charges connected to her name, the case quickly attracted attention throughout Canada. The accusations were serious, involving the deaths of 3 people across different locations. However, as with any criminal case, accusations are not conclusions. The evidence must be examined through the legal system, and the facts must be proven in court. For investigators, the challenge was building a complete timeline. Every movement mattered. Where was the accused before each incident? Who had contact with the victims? Were there relationships between those involved? Was there a specific reason behind the alleged actions, or was there another explanation that had not yet been discovered? These questions would become the foundation of the investigation. Behind the official statements and police briefings were the human stories that often remain unseen. The victims were not simply names connected to a criminal case. They were people with families, friends, personal histories, and futures that were suddenly taken away. Their loved ones were forced into a reality they never expected. One moment, life followed its usual pattern. The next, everything changed. A phone call from authorities can divide a person's life into 2 parts, before and after. Before the tragedy, there are memories, plans, and ordinary moments that seemed permanent. Afterward, there are questions that may never have complete answers. For the families connected to this case, the investigation was not about statistics or headlines. It was about trying to understand the loss of someone who mattered. As police continued working across multiple jurisdictions, the case became a complex puzzle. Investigators had to separate facts from assumptions. They had to avoid being influenced by public fear and focus on evidence. Every piece of information had to be tested. The term, serial killer, carries a powerful emotional reaction. It creates images of deliberate, repeated violence. But legally and practically, investigators must prove connections through evidence. They must establish what happened, who was responsible, and why. In the Sabrina Kaldhar investigation, authorities believed the speed and circumstances of the deaths suggested a pattern that required immediate attention. The possibility of a person connected to multiple killings created one of the most serious investigative challenges for law enforcement. The communities involved were now connected by a case nobody expected. A city of millions. A region known for tourism and peaceful neighborhoods. A community shaped by industry and family life. Different places brought together by tragedy. As the investigation unfolded, police would search for the story hidden behind the timeline. They would examine relationships, movements, and evidence. They would attempt to answer the question that remained at the center of everything. How did 3 separate lives become connected to one investigation in just a matter of days? The answer would require looking beyond the headlines and beyond the accusations, into the events that came before the tragedy, the people involved, and the moments that led Ontario into one of its most disturbing criminal investigations of 2024. When a tragedy unfolds, the world often focuses first on the person accused. Headlines, police statements, and public conversations begin surrounding a name connected to the crime. But behind every investigation are the people whose lives ended, the individuals who existed long before they became part of a case file. They had ordinary mornings. They had personal struggles, dreams, relationships, and memories. They were not defined by the way their stories ended. The investigation, involving Sabrina Kaldhar, would eventually center around 3 victims whose deaths were connected by police through a rapidly developing chain of events across Ontario. But before they became names in a criminal investigation, they were people with their own stories, their own families, and their own places in the lives of those who loved them. That is the part of every true crime story that can never be forgotten. A victim is not simply a piece of evidence. A victim is someone who was known, someone who was missed, someone whose absence changed the lives of others forever. In the days after the deaths, families were left trying to understand something impossible. They were not only dealing with grief, they were dealing with uncertainty. They were trying to process how a person who had been part of their daily lives could suddenly be gone. There is a unique kind of pain that comes when a life is taken unexpectedly. There is no time to prepare, no final conversation, no chance to say goodbye. The world continues moving around the people left behind, even though their own lives feel frozen in one terrible moment. For investigators, every victim represented a timeline, a final known location, a last interaction, a collection of details that could help explain what happened. But for families, those same details represented something much deeper. They represented the last moments of someone they cared about. The victims connected to this case came from different parts of Ontario, and their lives were not simply chapters in a criminal investigation. Each person had their own history, their own personality, their own relationships that existed far away from the violence that would later surround their names. This is one of the most difficult parts of understanding cases involving multiple victims. The speed and shock of the events can sometimes make the public view the victims only through the circumstances of their deaths. But their lives were much larger than the tragedy that happened at the end. They were friends, family members, people who had routines and plans, people who woke up each day believing they had another tomorrow. The communities around them were forced to confront a sudden loss that arrived without warning. In places where people expected normal life, there was now fear and confusion. Neighbors wondered what they did not know. Friends replayed memories. Families searched for meaning in a situation that seemed impossible to understand. As police continued building their case, they also worked to understand the connections surrounding each victim. Was there a relationship between them and the accused? Was there a shared history? Did the events happen because of a specific conflict, or was there another explanation hidden beneath the surface? Those questions were important for investigators. But for the families, the most painful question was often simpler. Why? Why did this happen? Why their loved one? Why did an ordinary day become the final day of someone's life? The answers to those questions are often the hardest to find. In homicide investigations, detectives attempt to rebuild the past. They look at messages, movements, conversations, and decisions. They try to understand human behavior at the exact moment when everything changed. But no investigation can fully capture the personal world of a victim. A photograph cannot show every dream a person had. A witness statement cannot describe every kindness they showed. A case file cannot contain every memory shared with the people who love them. That is why telling the victims' stories matters. Because before the investigation began, before the police activity and court proceedings, there were lives being lived. There were people who had favorite places, favorite songs, private jokes, family traditions, small moments that seemed insignificant at the time but later became precious memories. The tragedy surrounding the Sabrina Kaldhar case was not only about the events that happened in October 2024. It was also about the lives interrupted by those events. 3 people lost. 3 families changed. 3 circles of friends left with questions that may never fully disappear. As the investigation moved forward, authorities would attempt to understand what brought these victims and the accused together. They would search for patterns and motives. They would examine the moments leading up to each death. But behind every piece of evidence was a person who had once been alive, moving through the same world as everyone else. They had plans for the future. They had people waiting for their calls. They had no idea that their names would become part of one of Ontario's most disturbing criminal investigations. The story of this case is not only about the person accused of causing harm. It is also about remembering those who were lost. Because long after the headlines fade and the legal process moves forward, the greatest impact of a tragedy is felt by the people left behind. The families who continue without a loved one. The friends who carry memories. The communities that try to heal. And at the center of everything are the victims, whose lives deserve to be remembered not because of how they died, but because of how they lived. The events that unfolded in October 2024 did not begin with a single moment that everyone immediately recognized as a turning point. There was no instant where the public knew a major criminal investigation was beginning. Instead, the story developed piece by piece, through separate discoveries, separate police responses, and separate moments when ordinary situations suddenly became something much darker. In the beginning, investigators were dealing with individual scenes. A call for help, a report that something was wrong, officers arriving and stepping into situations where they had no idea yet that they were looking at part of a much larger picture. That is often how complex investigations begin. The first responders do not walk into a mystery with all the answers already waiting for them. They arrive with limited information. They have to observe, document, and ask questions. They have to separate what appears obvious from what is actually supported by evidence. In Toronto, the discovery of a woman's death began a chain of events that would eventually draw the attention of multiple police services across Ontario. At that early stage, the focus was on understanding what had happened and who might be responsible. Every detail mattered: the condition of the scene, the timeline leading up to the discovery, the people connected to the victim, the information that witnesses could provide. Investigators know that in the first hours of a case, small details can become the foundation of everything that follows. A single piece of information that seems insignificant at first can later become the connection that reveals the truth. But as detectives continued working, another disturbing reality began to emerge. This might not have been an isolated incident. The investigation expanded beyond one location. Information from other areas began coming together, and authorities started examining whether separate events were connected. The distance between Toronto, Niagara region, and Hamilton became one of the most important elements of the case. These were not simply three scenes in one neighborhood. They were separate communities with different police departments, different witnesses, and different investigative challenges. Yet somehow, the events appeared to be linked. The possibility that the same person could be connected to multiple deaths in a short period of time changed the entire nature of the investigation. Police were no longer only asking what happened at one location. They were asking whether there was a pattern. A pattern requires looking beyond individual moments. It requires examining movement, timing, relationships, and behavior. Detectives had to build a timeline that showed where people were when events happened and how each piece connected. The pressure was enormous. When investigators believe there may be a person responsible for multiple violent acts, every hour becomes important. The goal is not only to solve what has already happened, but also to understand whether there is a continuing danger. Communities react strongly to this kind of uncertainty. People begin looking for information. They want to know if they are safe. They want to know if there were warning signs. They want to know how something so serious could happen so quickly. But investigations rarely provide immediate answers. Police must work carefully. Rushing to conclusions can damage a case. Every accusation must be supported by evidence. Every theory must be tested. As authorities investigated the deaths connected to Sabrina Kaldhar, they faced the difficult task of understanding not only the events themselves, but also the circumstances surrounding them. What brought the accused and victims into contact? Were there personal connections? Were these incidents planned? Or were they the result of a rapidly escalating situation? These questions would shape the investigation. Meanwhile, the families of those who died were experiencing a completely different reality. While police worked through evidence and timelines, loved ones were dealing with grief that did not follow any schedule. There were no easy explanations, no simple way to accept that a person who had been part of their lives was suddenly gone. For them, the investigation was not about theories. It was about someone they knew, someone whose absence was now impossible to ignore. As news of the case spread, the public began learning about a series of deaths that appeared connected across Ontario. The speed of the events became one of the most shocking elements. 3 lives lost in a matter of days created the image of a situation unfolding faster than anyone could fully understand. Authorities had to move just as quickly. Different police agencies had to communicate and share information. Investigators needed to compare findings and determine what belonged to the same story and what did not. Behind closed doors, teams worked to reconstruct the sequence of events. Who was where? When did each incident occur? What happened between those moments? What evidence could reveal the truth? The answers would not come from one single discovery. They would come from collecting pieces of information and slowly building a complete picture. As the investigation continued, the name Sabrina Kaldhar became associated with one of the most serious criminal investigations in Ontario in 2024. She faced allegations connected to the deaths of 3 people, but the legal process would determine the facts through evidence presented in court. At this stage, investigators were focused on understanding the alleged sequence of events. The story was still incomplete. There were still unanswered questions. And somewhere within the timeline between Toronto, Niagara, and Hamilton was the truth that police were trying to uncover. The tragedy was no longer limited to one location. It had become a regional investigation, one that forced communities to confront the possibility that a series of separate moments had become connected by a single devastating thread. And as detectives continued following that thread, they moved closer to the next stage of the case, examining the evidence left behind and uncovering the first clues that could explain how 3 deaths became one of Ontario's most disturbing investigations. Part 5, The Discovery, the first clues behind a 3-city mystery. In the aftermath of the first discovery, the investigation entered a race against time. At first, police were dealing with what appeared to be a single tragic incident, a death that demanded answers but seemed isolated from everything else happening around it. Investigators arrived with the usual questions that follow a violent crime. Who was the victim? Who had access to them? What happened in the final moments before their life was taken? But as detectives began pulling apart the details, something unsettling started to appear. The pieces did not fit neatly into the picture of a single event. There were unanswered questions, strange connections, and details that suggested the possibility that something much larger was unfolding. The first hours after a homicide are often the most important. Every minute matters. Every conversation matters. A neighbor who saw a vehicle passing by, a phone record, a security camera, a message left unanswered, or a person who suddenly changes their behavior can become the thread that leads investigators toward the truth. In this case, that thread would eventually stretch beyond one neighborhood. The death in Toronto became the beginning of a much wider investigation. Detectives started examining every possible connection, trying to understand whether they were looking at an isolated act of violence or whether they were seeing the opening chapter of a much darker story. The challenge was the speed. Events were happening so quickly that investigators were not simply looking backward. They were trying to understand something that was still moving forward. As officers worked to identify what happened in Toronto, information began reaching investigators from other areas. Niagara region and Hamilton would soon become part of the same disturbing puzzle. Different police departments, different communities, different crime scenes, yet the possibility of one person connecting them all began to emerge. For investigators, this was the moment when the case changed. A murder investigation is already complicated. A series of connected killings across multiple jurisdictions creates an entirely different level of pressure. Officers must share information quickly, compare evidence, and determine whether similarities are coincidence or signs of a pattern. The question became impossible to ignore. Was there someone moving between these communities, leaving tragedy behind? The public was still trying to understand what had happened. News reports began spreading. Communities that normally felt separated by distance suddenly felt connected by fear. People began asking the same questions investigators were asking. Who were the victims? Why them? And what could possibly have driven someone to allegedly commit such violence in such a short period of time? Investigators focused on building a timeline. A timeline can reveal what a person wants to hide. It can show where someone was, who they contacted, and how one event may have led into another. The hours and days surrounding each death became critical. Detectives looked for movement, communication, relationships, and any evidence that could explain the connection between the 3 locations. Toronto, Niagara, and Hamilton were not just places on a map anymore. They represented separate moments in a sequence that investigators were trying desperately to reconstruct. Behind every piece of evidence was a human story. The victims were not just names in a police file. They were people with families, routines, memories, and futures that disappeared without warning. While investigators worked through evidence, families were left trying to understand how ordinary days had turned into unimaginable loss. For them, the investigation was not about solving a mystery. It was about finding answers to a question they never wanted to ask. Why did this happen? As detectives continued gathering information, attention turned toward Sabrina Kaldhar, the woman accused of being connected to the deaths. At that stage, investigators had to carefully separate suspicion from proof. An accusation begins an investigation, but evidence is what must eventually tell the story. Police examined her possible connections to the victims, her movements, and the circumstances surrounding each incident. They were looking for a complete picture, not just pieces that appeared to match. Was there a motive? Was there a relationship between the accused and the victims? Were these planned acts, or did something escalate into a deadly chain of events? These questions would become central to the investigation. The phrase serial killer began appearing in discussion surrounding the case because of the alleged pattern: multiple deaths, different locations, and a short period of time between events. But investigators understood that labels alone do not solve crimes. They needed facts. They needed evidence strong enough to explain not only what happened, but why. Behind closed doors, officers worked through information from multiple jurisdictions. A detail discovered in one city could suddenly change the meaning of something found somewhere else. A statement from a witness, a digital record, a piece of physical evidence, a moment captured on camera. Slowly, the picture began to form. The investigation became a search for the invisible connections between three separate tragedies. What looked like unrelated events at first began revealing similarities that demanded attention. For the communities involved, the uncertainty was one of the hardest parts. Fear grows in the space where answers are missing. People wondered if there were other victims, if there were other dangers, and if they truly understood the full scope of what had happened. Meanwhile, investigators continued working through the evidence, knowing that every decision mattered. A mistake could cost valuable time. A missed detail could leave important questions unanswered. The pressure was enormous because the alleged crimes had happened so close together. 3 lives lost, 3 locations, one investigation that continued expanding. As the case moved forward, investigators began preparing for the next stage, identifying exactly how the events connected, uncovering the sequence behind them, and determining what evidence would ultimately reveal about the person at the center of the investigation. The mystery was no longer about one death. It was about a chain of events that had shaken an entire region. And the deeper investigators looked, the more they realized that the story behind the 3 deaths was far more complex than anyone initially imagined. Part 6: The Investigation, Searching for the Truth Behind the 3 Deaths. As the investigation expanded across Toronto, Niagara region, and Hamilton, police found themselves facing a case unlike anything they had dealt with before. The challenge was no longer simply determining what happened at one location. They were trying to understand a sequence of events spread across different communities, different victims, and different circumstances. Every investigation begins with uncertainty. At the beginning, detectives rarely have the full picture. They have fragments, a name, a location, a time frame, a witness statement that may reveal something important or may lead nowhere. The job is to take those scattered pieces and slowly build a story that explains the unexplainable. For the investigators working on the Sabrina Caldhar case, the first priority was establishing the connections. Were the 3 deaths connected because of coincidence, or was there a deliberate pattern behind them? The timeline became one of the most important pieces of the investigation. Detectives examined what happened before each death, where people had been, who they had contact with, and how events unfolded from one location to the next. In a case involving multiple jurisdictions, communication between police agencies becomes critical. Information that seems insignificant in one city can become the missing piece somewhere else. A detail discovered in Toronto could change how investigators viewed something in Hamilton. A witness statement from Niagara could suddenly provide context for an event that had seemed impossible to explain. The investigation became a process of connecting invisible lines. Meanwhile, the public was searching for answers of their own. The speed of the alleged crimes created a sense of fear because it challenged the normal understanding of safety. These were not events separated by years. They happened within days, creating the impression that danger was moving from one place to another. Communities began paying closer attention. People remembered conversations. People reviewed moments that had seemed ordinary at the time. Someone might suddenly wonder if a brief interaction, a passing encounter, or a strange moment they had ignored was actually something meaningful. That is often the psychological effect of a major criminal investigation. After tragedy happens, people look back at the past searching for signs they may have missed. Investigators, however, could not rely on speculation. They needed evidence. They needed facts that could survive examination in court. The focus turned toward Sabrina Caldhar and her alleged connection to the victims. Detectives examined her background, her movements, and the circumstances surrounding the 3 deaths. But an investigation of this scale requires patience. Police cannot simply assume they understand a person based on accusations. They must carefully document every step, every piece of evidence, and every connection. The central questions remained. What relationship, if any, existed between Kaldhar and the victims? Did the victims know each other? Was there a common factor linking them together? Or were investigators looking at separate events connected only by timing? These questions created multiple possibilities. One theory may appear convincing at first, only for new evidence to completely change the direction of the investigation. Detectives had to consider every possibility while avoiding tunnel vision. At the same time, investigators worked to understand the circumstances surrounding each individual death. Each victim had their own story, their own life, and their own final moments. A common mistake in public discussions of violent crimes is focusing only on the accused. But for investigators and families, the victims remain at the center. Every piece of evidence represented a person who mattered. Every question was connected to someone whose life had been interrupted. As investigators gathered information, they began building a clearer timeline of the events leading up to the 3 deaths. They looked at communication records, witness accounts, and any available evidence that could reveal what happened in the hours before each incident. The investigation moved slowly but deliberately. Behind the scenes, officers worked through the difficult task of separating truth from rumor. In high-profile cases, information spreads quickly, and not everything reported publicly is accurate. Investigators had to focus on what could be proven. The pressure was enormous. A community wanted immediate answers. Families wanted justice. Police needed certainty. The possibility that one person could allegedly be connected to 3 deaths in 3 different areas created urgency, unlike a typical investigation. Officers understood that the stakes were high, and every decision could affect the outcome of the case. As more details emerged, the investigation began shifting from simply asking what happened to asking why. Motive is often one of the hardest parts of a criminal investigation. Evidence can show where someone was and what they did, but understanding the reason behind an act requires a deeper look into relationships, emotions, conflicts, and personal circumstances. Investigators began searching for that missing explanation. Was there a hidden conflict? Was there a personal connection? Was there something that had been building before the alleged violence occurred? The answers were not immediately clear. The case remained a puzzle with many unanswered pieces. But slowly, investigators were moving closer. The 3 locations that once seemed separate were becoming part of one larger narrative. The deaths that shocked 3 different communities were now being examined through the same investigative lens. And as police continued following the evidence, the question that had haunted the beginning of the investigation remained stronger than ever. How did a short period of time lead to the loss of 3 lives? The answer would depend on the evidence, still waiting to be uncovered. Part 7, the breakthrough, the moment the pieces began to connect. For investigators working on the Sabrina Kaldhar case, the turning point did not come from one single discovery. It came from the gradual realization that separate pieces of information were beginning to point in the same direction. A case like this is built slowly. There is no single moment where everything suddenly becomes clear. Instead, detectives spend countless hours reviewing evidence, comparing timelines, and asking the same questions repeatedly until something changes. A detail that once seemed meaningless can suddenly become the key that unlocks the entire investigation. As police continued examining the deaths in Toronto, Niagara region, and Hamilton, the idea that these incidents were connected became harder to ignore. The investigation was no longer focused only on individual crime scenes. It became a search for a pattern. Patterns are often hidden in small details: the route someone traveled, the timing of events, a conversation, a relationship, a decision made moments before something irreversible happened. Investigators began looking at the bigger picture. They were not only asking what happened at each location, but how each event fit into the timeline of the days leading up to the tragedy. The geography of the case became one of its most disturbing elements. Toronto, Niagara, Hamilton, different communities with different neighborhoods, yet all connected by one investigation. For police, the challenge was determining whether the connection was intentional or accidental. They had to build a case based on evidence, not assumptions. The pressure surrounding the investigation continued to grow. Families of the victims were waiting for answers, while the public wanted to understand how 3 people could lose their lives in such a short period of time. Behind the scenes, investigators followed every possible lead. They reviewed information from witnesses who may have seen something unusual. They examined details that could establish movement and timing. They worked to understand the relationships between those involved. Every piece mattered because the smallest detail could reveal the sequence of events. As the investigation progressed, attention increasingly centered on Sabrina Kaldhar. Police believed they had enough information to identify her as the person allegedly connected to the 3 deaths. But identifying a suspect is only one stage of an investigation. The next challenge is proving what happened. A strong criminal case requires more than suspicion. It requires evidence that explains the events clearly and connects the accused to the alleged crimes. Investigators had to reconstruct the story. They had to show where people were. They had to determine what happened. They had to understand the moments before each death. The investigation became a process of rebuilding time itself. Every hour mattered. Every movement mattered. Every decision mattered. As the case developed, one of the biggest questions remained the motive. Without understanding why something happened, investigators often struggle to explain the full story. A person's actions do not happen in isolation. There are usually circumstances surrounding them, whether personal conflicts, emotional pressure, relationships, or other factors that investigators must examine. The search for motive became part of a larger effort to understand the alleged chain of events. The question was not only who was responsible, it was what brought the situation to such an extreme point. For the families of the victims, the investigation was deeply personal. They were not following a mystery from a distance. They were living with the consequences every single day. 3 families were forced to face an unimaginable reality. The people they loved were gone. The future they expected had disappeared. And the answers they needed depended on a long and complicated investigation. As police continued gathering evidence, the case began moving toward the next stage. The initial uncertainty was slowly being replaced by a clearer understanding of the timeline and the alleged connections between the deaths. The investigation that began with questions was now beginning to produce answers. But with those answers came even more difficult questions. If the deaths were connected, why did they happen? What events led to those final moments? And what could have prevented the tragedy from unfolding? The breakthrough was not just about identifying a suspect. It was about revealing the hidden sequence behind 3 separate locations and 3 lives lost. The investigation had crossed a critical point. Police were no longer searching blindly. They were building a narrative that would eventually have to be tested inside a courtroom, where evidence would determine whether the accusations could become proven facts. And as the case moved closer to that moment, the story of Sabrina Kaldhar and the 3 deaths connected to her name became one of the most closely watched criminal investigations in Canada. Part 8. The Justice, the Courtroom Battle, and the Search for Accountability. After months of investigation, the case surrounding Sabrina Kaldhar moved from the streets and police departments into the courtroom, where evidence, testimony, and legal arguments would determine the next chapter. A courtroom is a place where every detail is questioned. A timeline can be challenged. A witness can be examined. A piece of evidence can be interpreted in different ways. For the families of the victims, the courtroom was not just a legal process. It was the place where they hoped to finally understand what happened to the people they loved. The accusations against Sabrina Kaldhar were serious. Prosecutors presented the case as a series of connected events involving 3 deaths across different locations in Ontario. They argued that the evidence showed a pattern, a sequence of actions that could not be viewed as separate tragedies. The defense, however, had the responsibility of challenging those claims. In any criminal trial, the accused has the right to be heard, and the prosecution must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That is the foundation of the justice system. The courtroom became a place where 2 different versions of events would meet. One side focused on the evidence collected during the investigation and the alleged connection between the 3 deaths. The other side examined whether the evidence truly proved the accusations. Behind every legal argument were 3 victims whose lives had ended suddenly. Their families sat through a process that forced them to revisit painful moments again and again. Trials involving multiple deaths carry a unique emotional weight. The discussion is not only about facts and evidence. It is also about the human impact behind those facts. A name on a document represents a person. A date represents a final moment. A location represents a place where a life changed forever. As prosecutors built their case, they focused on the timeline and the alleged connections between the incidents. They attempted to show how events unfolded over those critical days and why they believe Sabrina Kaldhar was responsible. Investigators described the work involved in connecting information from different areas. What began as separate investigations eventually became one larger case. The prosecution argued that the speed and circumstances surrounding the deaths suggested more than coincidence. They pointed to the short time frame. They pointed to the different locations. They pointed to the evidence they believed connected everything together. For the defense, the challenge was examining whether those connections were strong enough to prove criminal responsibility. A criminal trial is not about what seems possible. It is about what can be proven. Every piece of evidence must be examined carefully. Every conclusion must be supported. Every question must be answered. The courtroom process forced everyone involved to look closely at the events that had shocked Ontario. What happened during those days? What decisions were made? What circumstances led to the deaths of 3 people? And most importantly, could the evidence explain the full story? For the families, there was no simple outcome. Even a conviction could not bring back the people they lost. Justice in these cases cannot erase the pain. It cannot restore birthdays, conversations, family gatherings, or the ordinary moments that disappear when someone is gone. But for many families, accountability becomes an important part of healing. It is a way of saying that their loved ones mattered, that their lives were important, that what happened to them would not simply become another unsolved mystery. As the case continued through the legal system, public attention remained intense. The unusual circumstances surrounding the allegations had already made the investigation one of the most discussed criminal cases in Canada in 2024. People followed each development, trying to understand the same questions investigators and families had been asking from the beginning. What caused this chain of events? Was there something hidden beneath the surface? Could the warning signs have been recognized earlier? Those questions often remain even after a courtroom reaches its decision. Because criminal trials answer legal questions, but they do not always answer every emotional question. A verdict can determine responsibility under the law. It cannot always explain the full complexity of human behavior. The case of Sabrina Kaldhar became a reminder of how quickly ordinary lives can be changed. 3 communities were affected, 3 families were left with grief, and an investigation that began with uncertainty eventually became a search for truth through the justice system. The courtroom represented the final stage of one journey, but for the families of the victims, their journey continued. They would have to carry memories, loss, and unanswered emotions long after the legal proceedings ended. The justice system could deliver a verdict, but healing would take much longer. The story of Sabrina Kaldhar and the 3 lives lost across Ontario in October 2024 does not end with an arrest, a courtroom, or a police statement. For the families left behind, the investigation is only one chapter in a much longer and more painful journey. A criminal case can determine responsibility through evidence and legal process, but it cannot repair the silence left behind when someone is suddenly taken away. 3 different communities were touched by the same shocking sequence of events. Toronto, Niagara region, and Hamilton are places filled with ordinary routines. People wake up, go to work, visit family, drive through familiar streets, and assume that the world around them is predictable. But within only a few days, that sense of safety was shaken. A case that began as separate tragedies slowly became something much larger, something that forced investigators and the public to look at how quickly violence can move from one place to another. For the families of the victims, the word investigation carries a completely different meaning. To police, it means gathering evidence, analyzing timelines, and building a case. To families, it means waiting for answers while trying to accept an unbearable reality. It means looking at a phone that will never receive another message. It means walking into a room and seeing the belongings of someone who should still be there. It means remembering a person not by how they died, but by how they lived. Every victim had a story before becoming a name in a news report. They had relationships, memories, habits, and people who cared about them. Their lives were not defined by the final moments that brought them into the spotlight. Behind the headlines were ordinary human beings who had dreams, fears, and futures that were suddenly interrupted. As investigators continued working through the evidence, one of the biggest questions remained unanswered. Why? What could have caused a chain of events involving 3 separate deaths in such a short period of time? Was there a single motive connecting everything? Were the victims chosen for a specific reason? Or was the answer buried inside a complicated series of personal circumstances that only a full trial could reveal? Those questions are often the most difficult part of any violent crime. The human mind searches for patterns because randomness is terrifying. People want to believe there is always a clear warning sign, a simple explanation, a moment where someone could have stepped in and prevented tragedy. But real cases are often more complicated. They are built from countless decisions, emotions, relationships, and moments that may only become clear after everything has already happened. The investigation into Sabrina Kaldhar became a reminder that criminal cases are not just about the accused. They are also about the victims, the communities affected, and the systems responsible for finding the truth. Police agencies from different regions had to work together, sharing information and connecting events that at first appeared separate. The ability to recognize links between cases became a crucial part of understanding what happened. For the public, the case created fear because of its speed. The idea that 3 deaths could happen across different locations within days created the feeling of an invisible threat moving through familiar communities. But behind that fear was also a deeper conversation about prevention, awareness, and how authorities respond when warning signs appear. Cases involving accusations of multiple killings often lead people to search for a simple label. Words like serial killer or mass murderer immediately attract attention because they create an image people recognize from movies and documentaries. But behind those labels are complex investigations, legal definitions, and unanswered questions. The courtroom, not public opinion, is where evidence must ultimately determine what happened. As the legal process continues, Sabrina Kaldhar remains entitled to the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. The accusations against her are serious, but the responsibility of proving those allegations belongs to the justice system. Every piece of evidence must be examined, every testimony considered, and every detail carefully evaluated. For investigators, the goal is not only to identify what happened but to understand the sequence that led there. A timeline can show where someone was. Evidence can show what occurred. But understanding why something happened often requires looking deeper into human behavior, relationships, and circumstances. The tragedy of this case is measured not only by the number of victims, but by the speed at which everything unfolded. In a matter of days, 3 families experienced a loss that would change their lives forever. There was no gradual goodbye, no chance to prepare, no opportunity to say the things people often wish they had said. That is the part of violent crime that statistics cannot capture. Numbers can tell us how many people were affected, but they cannot show the empty chair at a family dinner. They cannot show the person checking the door, still expecting someone to come home. They cannot show the memories that continue long after the investigation ends. The community response after such events often reveals another side of humanity. Strangers offer support, neighbors look after one another. People who never knew the victims speak their names and recognize that behind every headline was a person who mattered. Over time, attention from the outside world may fade. News cycles move on. New stories replace old ones. But for those closest to the victims, the passage of time does not erase what happened. Healing does not mean forgetting. It means learning how to carry a loss that cannot be changed. The Sabrina Kaldhar case will remain a significant moment in Canadian true crime history because of the circumstances surrounding it. The short timeline, the multiple locations, and the questions that emerged afterward. But the lasting impact will not only be about the accused or the investigation. It will be about the people whose lives were forever altered. Every crime leaves behind a trail. There is the physical evidence collected by investigators. There are the statements, reports, and courtroom arguments. But there is also an emotional trail, the pain carried by families, the fear felt by communities, and the unanswered questions that remain long after the cameras leave. The pursuit of justice is often slow because the truth requires patience. It requires examining every detail, even the ones that seem insignificant. It requires listening to voices that may be difficult to hear. And most importantly, it requires remembering that behind every case file are real human lives. The story of October 2024 in Ontario is ultimately a story about loss, uncertainty, and the search for answers. It is a reminder that every person we pass on the street carries an entire world within them. They have people who love them, memories that belong only to them, and a future that should have continued. As the legal process moves forward, one question remains at the center of everything. What truly happened during those days that changed so many lives forever? Only the evidence, the investigation, and the justice system can answer that question. But for the families who lost someone, the most important truth has already been known since the moment they received the devastating news. Someone they loved is gone, and nothing can ever bring them back. Months after the shocking events connected to Sabrina Kaldhar, the communities of Ontario were left trying to understand something that felt almost impossible to comprehend. 3 people had lost their lives in a matter of days, across 3 different locations. Toronto, Niagara region, and Hamilton were not connected by distance, but suddenly they were connected by tragedy. For investigators, the case represented a race against time. For the families of the victims, time seemed to stop completely. While police worked through evidence, interviews, and unanswered questions, loved ones were left facing a reality they never expected. Someone they cared about was gone, and the circumstances surrounding that loss were filled with confusion and pain. The phrase used by police, describing the case as having characteristics of a serial killer investigation, captured the public's attention. It was a phrase that immediately changed the way people viewed the events. A single incident was frightening enough, but the possibility that 3 separate deaths could be connected created a wave of fear throughout the region. People began asking the same questions. How could something like this happen? Were there warning signs? Could anything have prevented these deaths? And perhaps the biggest question of all, what was happening inside the mind of the person accused? In cases like this, investigators often look beyond the moment a crime occurs. They look backward. They search through relationships, communication records, personal histories, and patterns of behavior. They try to understand not only what happened, but why. A crime scene can reveal what happened in a physical sense. Evidence can show where someone was when something occurred and what actions may have taken place. But understanding motivation is often far more complicated. Human behavior does not always follow a simple path. Behind every accusation is a story of choices, emotions, conflicts, and circumstances that investigators must carefully examine. The investigation into Sabrina Kaldhar became a complex puzzle spread across multiple jurisdictions. Different police departments had to communicate and compare information. Details that might appear insignificant in one location could become important when placed beside evidence from another. A phone call, a vehicle movement, a timeline, a person seen in a particular place, a connection between individuals that had previously gone unnoticed. In major investigations, the smallest details can become the pieces that finally reveal the larger picture. For the public, the case created a sense of uncertainty. Many people living in Ontario communities watched the news closely, trying to understand whether there was a danger still present around them. The idea that events could unfold across several cities within such a short period made the situation feel unpredictable. But behind the headlines were real people whose lives had been interrupted forever. The victims were not just names in an investigation file. They were people with families, memories, routines, and futures that disappeared in an instant. They had ordinary moments before their deaths. They had people who expected to hear their voices again, receive a message from them, or see them walk through the door. That is often the hardest reality in violent crime cases. The world continues moving forward, but for the families left behind, one moment becomes the dividing line between before and after. Before the tragedy, there were plans, conversations, and everyday experiences. Afterward, there are questions, grief, and the search for answers. As the legal process moved forward, the case entered a different stage. Investigators gathered evidence, but the court system would ultimately determine responsibility. In Canada, accusations are not conclusions. They must be tested through evidence, testimony, and legal procedures. This distinction became an important part of the story. The public reaction was intense, but the justice system operates differently from public opinion. Every piece of evidence must be examined. Every claim must be challenged. Every detail must be carefully considered. The investigation also raised broader questions about how authorities respond when multiple incidents appear connected. Modern policing depends heavily on cooperation. Separate departments must recognize patterns, share information, and build a complete picture from scattered pieces. A case that begins as one investigation can suddenly expand into something much larger. Detectives must constantly ask themselves whether they are looking at isolated events or part of a wider pattern. In the case surrounding Sabrina Kaldhar, that question became central. Was there a single chain of events connecting the 3 deaths? Were the victims chosen for specific reasons? Or were investigators dealing with a series of events that only appeared connected because of their timing? Those questions would require careful examination. Another difficult aspect of the case was trying to understand whether there were missed opportunities. After violent events occur, people often look back and search for moments that might have changed the outcome. They examine previous interactions, past conflicts, and possible warning signs. But investigations after tragedies are complicated. Information that seems obvious afterward may not have been clear beforehand. Human behavior can be unpredictable, and not every concerning moment becomes a criminal act. For the families affected, those questions may never fully disappear. Grief often comes with a search for meaning. People want explanations because explanations create a sense of order. But some tragedies leave behind painful uncertainty. The story of Sabrina Kaldhar became more than a criminal investigation. It became a reflection of how quickly ordinary life can change, how communities respond to fear, and how the justice system attempts to uncover the truth. Every criminal case eventually reaches a point where the focus shifts from what happened to what comes next. For investigators, that means preparing evidence and presenting facts. For prosecutors, it means building a case that can withstand examination. For defense teams, it means ensuring the accused receives a fair process. For families, it means learning how to live with a loss that cannot be reversed. And for communities, it means trying to regain a sense of safety. The events of 2024 left a permanent mark on those connected to the case. The names of the victims became part of a story they never wanted to be part of. Their families carried memories of who they were before the tragedy, not just the circumstances of how they were lost. That is something often forgotten when cases dominate the news. Behind every investigation file is a human story. Behind every courtroom appearance are people whose lives have been changed forever. As the legal process continued, the unanswered questions surrounding the case remained at the center of public attention. People wanted to understand what could drive a situation towards such devastating consequences. But sometimes, even after evidence is presented and decisions are made, some questions remain. Because a criminal investigation can determine what happened. A courtroom can determine legal responsibility. But understanding the full complexity of human actions is sometimes much harder. The story of Sabrina Kaldhar stands as a reminder that behind every headline is a collection of lives, choices, and moments that cannot be separated from the people involved. 3 locations, 3 victims, 1 investigation that captured the attention of an entire province, and a question that continues to echo long after the first reports emerged. How did a series of events unfold so quickly, and what could have changed the outcome before it was too late? In the months after the arrest of Sabrina Kaldhar, the communities of Ontario were left with a feeling that was difficult to describe. There was relief that a suspect had been identified and taken into custody, but there was also a deep sense of unease. 3 people had lost their lives in a matter of days. 3 families had been forced into a nightmare that they never imagined. And the questions surrounding those deaths remained unanswered. For many people watching the case unfold from the outside, the story was about timelines, locations, and police investigations. It was about Toronto, Niagara region, and Hamilton appearing on the same map as investigators searched for connections. It was about the speed at which events unfolded, and the fear that spread when authorities realized they might not be looking at separate tragedies, but at a connected series of violent acts. But for the families of the victims, there was nothing theoretical about what happened. There were empty chairs at dinner tables, unanswered messages on phones, personal belongings left exactly where they had been before everything changed. There were birthdays that would never be celebrated, conversations that would never happen, and ordinary moments that suddenly became memories. The investigation had transformed 3 ordinary lives into a public story, but behind every headline was a person who had existed long before their name appeared in the news. They had families, They had routines. They had dreams. And now, those who loved them were left trying to understand how their lives could be taken away so suddenly. The case of Sabrina Kaldhar also raised difficult questions about the nature of violence itself. When a person is accused of committing multiple killings in such a short period of time, investigators, psychologists, and the public often search for a simple explanation. They look for a single moment, a single reason, or a single event that can explain how someone could move from ordinary life into extreme violence. But real investigations rarely provide simple answers. Human behavior is complicated. A person's actions can be influenced by countless factors, and understanding what happened requires careful examination of evidence, relationships, history, and circumstances. In this case, investigators face the challenge of reconstructing not only what happened, but why. What connected the victims? What was happening in the days leading up to the killings? Was there a pattern that could have been recognized earlier? Or were these events a sudden and unpredictable explosion of violence? These questions became central as the legal process moved forward. The term, serial killer, carries a powerful emotional weight. It immediately creates an image in the public imagination. Someone who repeatedly commits violence, someone who moves from one victim to another. But behind that label is a complex investigative process. Police must establish facts. They must examine evidence. They must prove connections beyond suspicion. A person accused of a crime is still entitled to a fair trial, and the court system exists to determine what can be proven through evidence. For the families involved, however, the emotional reality existed long before a courtroom decision. They had already experienced the most painful moment imaginable, the loss of someone they loved. As investigators continued their work, the case became a reminder of how quickly a community can be shaken. Toronto, Niagara, and Hamilton are not small isolated places. They are communities filled with people going to work, raising families, attending school, and living ordinary lives. The idea that a violent chain of events could unfold across these areas created fear because it disrupted the assumption that danger is always somewhere far away. Sometimes, the most frightening cases are the ones that begin quietly. A normal day, a normal street, a person leaving home. A moment that seems insignificant until later, when investigators look back and realize it was part of something much larger. That is one of the most difficult parts of criminal investigations. Detectives are often forced to look backward. They take fragments of information and attempt to rebuild a timeline. They search through phone records, surveillance footage, witness statements, digital evidence, and personal histories. Every detail becomes important. A message, a meeting, a movement from one location to another, a decision made in a matter of seconds. The investigation into the deaths connected to Sabrina Kaldhar became a massive effort involving multiple police jurisdictions. Cooperation between different agencies became essential because the alleged events crossed boundaries. No single department had the entire picture at the beginning. Each location held only a piece of a story. Toronto had one part, Niagara had another, Hamilton had another. Together, investigators attempted to create a complete picture. For the public, the case also became a conversation about warning signs. Could anything have prevented what happened? Were there moments when someone noticed something unusual? Were there opportunities to intervene? These questions appear after many violent crimes, but they are among the hardest to answer. Because hindsight changes everything. After tragedy happens, details that once seemed small can suddenly appear significant. A strange interaction, a troubling behavior, a moment that felt uncomfortable but was dismissed. However, people do not always know what they are witnessing in the moment. Most unusual moments do not lead to violence. Most conflicts do not become tragedies. That uncertainty is part of what makes preventing violence so challenging. The aftermath of the case was not only about Sabrina Kaldhar or the investigation surrounding her. It was also about the victims and how their stories would be remembered. In many crime stories, the accused person becomes the focus. Their name appears repeatedly. Their actions become the center of attention. But the lives lost should never disappear behind the investigation. A victim is more than the final moment of their life. They are the years before it, the people they loved, the experiences they shared, the impact they had on others. Every person taken in a violent crime leaves behind a story that began long before the tragedy. And that is where the true weight of these cases is found. Not only in understanding the accused, but in remembering those who never got the chance to continue their own stories. As the legal process continued, the families of the victims faced a long and difficult journey. Justice through the courts can be important, but it cannot reverse what happened. A conviction, a sentence, or a verdict cannot bring someone back. It can only answer certain questions. It can only acknowledge responsibility. The emotional healing process is something different. It happens slowly. It happens through memories, through support from loved ones, through finding ways to continue living while carrying an absence that never fully disappears. The Sabrina Kaldhar case remains a disturbing example of how quickly lives can change and how interconnected communities can become when faced with tragedy. It is a story about investigation, but it is also a story about loss. It is about the search for answers after something unimaginable happens. It is about the work of investigators trying to understand a chain of events. It is about families trying to survive after losing someone they love. And it is about a question that remains at the center of many true crime cases. How does a person reach the point where another human life becomes something they are willing to take? The answer is rarely simple. But the search for that answer is what continues long after the headlines fade. Because behind every case file, behind every police report, and behind every courtroom appearance, there are real people whose lives were forever changed. And their stories deserve to be remembered. The case of Sabrina Kaldhar left behind a trail of questions that extended far beyond the courtroom and police investigation. For the families of the victims, there was no simple explanation, no single moment that could make sense of what happened. Their lives had been divided into a before and an after. Before those October days, they had routines, conversations, plans for the future. Afterward, they were forced into a reality where ordinary moments became painful reminders of someone who would never return. For investigators, the case represented a different kind of challenge. They were not only trying to understand what happened at 3 different locations, they were trying to understand how those events could unfold so quickly. The distance between Toronto, Niagara region, and Hamilton created a disturbing timeline, one that suggested movement, urgency, and a series of decisions that investigators needed to reconstruct piece by piece. In a case like this, the most difficult questions are often not about what happened, but why. Why these victims? Why these locations? Why within such a short period of time? Those questions can remain unanswered for years, even after charges are laid, because the human mind behind an alleged crime is often the hardest thing to uncover. The investigation into Sabrina Kaldhar focused on building that timeline. Detectives examined communications, movements, relationships, and any evidence that could explain the connection between the separate incidents. Every detail mattered. A phone record, a vehicle movement, a witness statement, or a small inconsistency could change the direction of an investigation. The public often sees criminal investigations as moments of dramatic discovery, a single piece of evidence that suddenly reveals everything. In reality, many cases are built slowly. Officers collect thousands of details, many of which seem meaningless at first. They compare information from different departments. They return to witnesses and ask questions again. They search for patterns hidden inside chaos. The Sabrina Kaldhar case required cooperation between multiple police jurisdictions. Toronto investigators were looking at events within their own city. Niagara investigators were examining what happened in their region. Hamilton investigators had their own scene, their own evidence, and their own questions. But as information began to move between agencies, the possibility of a connection became impossible to ignore. That cooperation became one of the defining elements of a case. A crime that begins in one community can quickly affect another. When investigators believe the same person may be responsible for multiple incidents, time becomes critical. They are not only trying to solve a crime that already happened, they are trying to prevent the possibility of another one. For the communities involved, fear spread quickly. People began looking at familiar streets differently. Places that had once represented normal daily life suddenly became associated with tragedy. Neighbors wondered if they had unknowingly crossed paths with someone connected to the investigation. People searched for explanations, trying to understand how something so shocking could happen so close to home. But while the public searched for answers, investigators had to remain focused on facts. They could not rely on rumors or assumptions. They needed evidence that could stand in court. Every accusation had to be supported. Every conclusion had to be tested. This is one of the most important principles in any criminal case. A person can be accused of terrible acts, but the justice system requires proof. Investigators must separate what is known from what is suspected. Prosecutors must present evidence. Courts must determine responsibility based on facts. The allegations against Sabrina Kaldhar created a complex legal process. The charges were serious, involving accusations connected to the deaths of 3 people. But the legal system moves carefully because the consequences are permanent. A conviction does not simply represent the end of a case. It represents a formal judgment about what happened and who was responsible. Behind the legal language were real people. The victims were not just names in a police report. They had families, friendships, memories, and lives that existed long before the investigation began. Their stories became an essential part of understanding the true impact of the case. In many high-profile criminal cases, attention often focuses on the accused person. The media follows every development, every court appearance, every statement from investigators. But the center of the story should always remain the people who lost their lives. The families of the victims had to face a painful reality. They were not only grieving a death, they were trying to understand a sudden and violent loss that came without warning. They had to deal with questions that might never receive complete answers. Grief after a violent crime is different from ordinary loss. There is often anger mixed with sadness. There is confusion mixed with memories. Families may replay the final days, wondering if something could have been different. They may search for signs they missed, conversations they wish they had, moments they wish they could revisit. For investigators, respecting those families is part of the responsibility. Solving a case is not only about identifying a suspect. It is also about giving victims and their loved ones the truth they deserve. As the case continued through the justice system, attention remained focused on what evidence would reveal. The prosecution would have to explain the connection between the incidents. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge those claims. The court process would examine the facts carefully. The story of Sabrina Kaldhar became a reminder of how quickly lives can change. In just a few days, multiple communities were connected by tragedy. 3 separate locations became part of the same investigation. 3 lives became the center of a case that captured national attention. But beyond the headlines, the case represented something deeper. It showed the difficult reality faced by law enforcement when violence crosses boundaries. It showed the importance of cooperation between agencies. It showed the painful journey families experience when they lose someone unexpectedly. And it left behind one question that continues to surround the case. What events, decisions, and circumstances led to those October days? The answer would not come from speculation. It would come from evidence, testimony, and the slow process of justice. Because in the end, every investigation is a search for the truth, not only about what happened, but about the people whose lives were forever changed by it. In the aftermath of the investigation, the name Sabrina Kaldhar remained at the center of a storm that extended far beyond the courtroom. For many people in Ontario, the case was no longer only about a woman accused of taking 3 lives. It became a painful reminder of how quickly ordinary communities can be shaken when violence appears without warning and when the answers seem impossible to find. The events that unfolded across Toronto, Niagara region, and Hamilton left behind 3 separate scenes of grief. Each location carried its own story, its own memories, and its own people who had to wake up one day knowing that someone they loved would never come home again. For investigators, the work did not end when an arrest was made. A case involving multiple deaths in different jurisdictions requires patience, precision, and a careful reconstruction of every moment. Every phone record, every camera image, every conversation, and every piece of physical evidence had to be examined. The goal was not simply to build a timeline, but to understand how these events connected and what led to such a devastating chain of violence. The question that followed the entire investigation was one that haunted many observers. How could 3 lives be lost within such a short period of time? In many homicide cases, detectives spend weeks, months, or even years searching for a connection. They look for hidden relationships, financial motives, personal conflicts, or moments where anger escalated into violence. But this case unfolded with a terrifying speed. The distance between locations created the feeling that something was moving from one community to another, leaving confusion and fear behind. The public saw the headlines. They saw the accusations. They saw the images connected to the investigation. But behind every headline were families trying to understand a reality they never imagined they would face. A person who leaves home in the morning expects to return. A phone call is expected to be answered. A familiar face is expected to appear again. The sudden loss of a loved one creates a silence that is difficult to explain. For the families of the victims, the investigation was not a story unfolding on television. It was their entire world changing in a matter of days. As the legal process continued, the victims remained at the heart of the case. Their names represented more than their deaths. They represented lives that existed before the tragedy. They had relationships, routines, memories, and people who cared about them. This is often the hardest part of violent crime stories. The focus naturally shifts toward the accused person, the investigation, and the questions surrounding the crime. But the people who lost their lives cannot become background characters. Their stories existed long before the moment that brought them into the public eye. The investigation into Sabrina Kaldhar also raised broader questions about warning signs and prevention. When someone is accused of committing multiple acts of violence, people often search for a single explanation. They want to know if there was one moment, one decision, or one event that caused everything to happen. But human behavior is complicated. Acts of extreme violence rarely come from a single simple reason. Investigators and experts often look at many factors: relationships, personal history, emotional state, conflicts, and circumstances surrounding the events. At the same time, it is important to remember that accusations are not conclusions. A person charged with a crime must face the legal process, where evidence is examined and decisions are made according to the standards of the justice system. The court process represents a different stage of the story. Outside the courtroom, people often form opinions based on what they hear and see. Inside the courtroom, every detail must be tested. Witnesses must be questioned. Evidence must be challenged. The responsibility is to determine what can be proven. For the families involved, waiting for answers can feel like another form of suffering. Time moves forward, but grief does not always follow the same timeline. A trial date, an investigation update, or a legal decision may happen months later, but the pain began on the day their loved one was lost. The Sabrina Kaldhar case also showed the challenges of modern investigations. Multiple police services must communicate across regions. Information must move quickly while remaining accurate. A delay, a misunderstanding, or a misconnection can change the direction of an investigation. In cases involving multiple locations, detectives are not only searching for what happened, they are searching for patterns. They are trying to understand whether separate incidents are actually pieces of the same story. That process requires investigators to look beyond the obvious. A person's movements, relationships, and decisions before and after an incident may become important. Sometimes the smallest detail becomes the piece that connects everything together. For the communities involved, the shock was not only because of the number of victims, but because of the uncertainty. When a violent crime happens, people often ask if it could happen again. They wonder if there was danger nearby that they did not recognize. Fear grows in the spaces where information is missing. But as the investigation progressed, authorities worked to replace uncertainty with facts. They gathered evidence, followed leads, and continued building the case. Years from now, people may remember this case because of the unusual circumstances surrounding it. The locations, the timeline, the accusations, the attention it received. But for those closest to the victims, the memory will be different. They will remember birthdays, conversations, small habits, the things that made someone unique. A crime scene is temporary. Police tape eventually disappears. News coverage eventually fades. Court documents are eventually filed away. But loss remains. The story of Sabrina Kaldhar became a chapter in Canadian crime history, but it was also a reminder of the human cost behind every investigation. 3 people lost their lives. 3 families were changed forever. Communities that once felt ordinary were forced to confront questions they never expected to ask. The search for justice is not only about punishment. It is also about understanding. It is about creating a record of what happened, acknowledging those who were harmed, and ensuring that the victims are remembered as more than names connected to a tragedy. As the legal journey continued, one question remained at the center of everything. What truly happened during those days when 3 communities were connected by violence? The answer would not come from rumors or speculation. It would come from evidence, testimony, and the careful work of the justice system. And for the families waiting for closure, that search for the truth was the only path forward. In the months after the accusations against Sabrina Caldhar became public, the story no longer belonged only to police reports, court documents, and news headlines. It became something much larger. It became a painful reminder of how quickly ordinary communities can be shaken when violence appears without warning, when familiar streets become connected by tragedy, and when families are forced to search for answers that may never fully heal the wounds left behind. For investigators, the work continued long after the initial arrests and the first wave of public attention. A case involving multiple deaths across different regions is never solved by a single piece of evidence. It is built slowly, layer by layer, through interviews, forensic analysis, digital records, surveillance footage, timelines, and the careful reconstruction of moments that no one else saw. The challenge was not only determining what happened, but understanding how 3 separate tragedies could unfold within such a short period of time. The investigators had to look beyond the locations themselves. Toronto, Niagara, and Hamilton were not just points on a map. They represented 3 separate communities, 3 separate crime scenes, and 3 families whose lives had been permanently changed. Each location carried its own unanswered questions. Who was present? What happened in the hours before the violence? Was there a connection between the people involved? Was there a pattern? Or were investigators looking at a series of events that only appeared connected because of the timing? These questions became central to the investigation. When authorities describe a case as involving a potential serial killer, the term immediately captures public attention. People imagine a certain type of offender, a calculated predator moving from place to place. But investigators know that reality is often far more complicated. Labels do not explain motives. They do not reveal the personal history behind an act of violence. They do not answer why one person chooses to harm another. Those answers require evidence, and evidence takes time. As the case moved forward, attention also turned towards Sabrina Caldhar herself. The public wanted to understand who she was before the allegations. How could someone accused of such serious crimes move through communities without obvious warning signs? Were there moments when someone noticed something unusual? Were there conversations, conflicts, or circumstances that had been overlooked? These are questions that often appear after shocking crimes. People search the past looking for clues. They look for the moment when everything changed. But human behavior is rarely simple. A person's history is made up of countless moments, choices, relationships, and experiences. Investigators must separate facts from assumptions, evidence from rumors, and reality from the stories created by public fear. Meanwhile, the families of the victims faced a reality far different from the discussions happening online and in the media. For them, this was not a mystery to solve. It was a loss they had to live with. Every investigation eventually reaches a point where the victims must remain at the center of the story. Behind every police file was a person who had a life before the tragedy. Someone with memories, relationships, routines, and dreams. They were not just names connected to a criminal case. They were people who woke up on ordinary days believing they would have more time. They were people whose loved ones expected phone calls, visits, and future moments together. And then suddenly, those expectations disappeared. The emotional impact of a case like this spreads beyond immediate family. Friends, co-workers, neighbors, and entire communities often feel the shock. A person who was once part of daily life becomes the subject of conversations about loss and violence. In the aftermath, communities often struggle with the same question. How could this happen? It is a question without an easy answer. The investigation into Sabrina Caldhar also highlighted the difficulty of preventing unpredictable acts of violence. Law enforcement agencies can respond to threats, investigate crimes, and hold suspects accountable, but they cannot see every danger before it happens. After major crimes, there is often a search for missed opportunities. Could someone have recognized a warning sign? Could something have been done differently? Could the outcome have changed? These questions are natural, They come from a desire to believe tragedy can always be prevented. But investigations often reveal a much more complicated reality. Sometimes danger is visible. Sometimes it is hidden. Sometimes the warning signs only become clear after the damage has already been done. As the legal process moved forward, the public discussion around the case continued. Some people focused on the accusations. Others focused on the victims. Many struggled with the uncertainty of a case that was still unfolding. The justice system operates differently from public opinion. Allegations must be tested. Evidence must be examined. Every person accused of a crime has the right to a fair process, because the purpose of a trial is not to satisfy public emotion, but to determine facts through law. For the victims' families, however, the waiting period can feel endless. Each court appearance can reopen painful memories. Each new development can bring back emotions they are trying to process. Grief does not move according to a legal schedule. It does not disappear when headlines fade. It remains in quiet moments. A photograph, a familiar place, a memory from years earlier, a simple reminder of someone who should still be there. The Sabrina Kaldhar case became one of the most discussed criminal investigations in Canada in 2024 because of the speed and geographic spread of the events. The idea that 3 lives could be lost within such a short time created fear and disbelief. But beyond the headlines was a deeper story about human lives interrupted. It was about communities forced to confront violence. It was about investigators trying to piece together the truth. It was about families searching for meaning after unimaginable loss. And it was about the responsibility of society to remember the people behind the case numbers. As time passed, the focus slowly shifted from the shock of the accusations toward the long process of seeking answers. Investigations end. Court cases eventually reach conclusions. Headlines disappear. But the impact of tragedy continues. For those who lost someone, there is no true ending. There is only learning how to carry the absence. The streets of Toronto, Niagara, and Hamilton continued moving forward. People went to work, children went to school, and daily life returned. But for the families affected, life was permanently divided into 2 parts. Before and after. The story of Sabrina Kaldhar remains a reminder that behind every criminal investigation are human beings searching for justice, truth, and understanding. The questions surrounding the case may take years to fully answer, but the importance of remembering the victims remains immediate. Because when a life is taken, the story should never only be about the person accused. It should also be about the people who were lost, the people who love them, the people who still remember them, and the lives that continue carrying the weight of what happened. The story of Sabrina Kaldhar is not only about the accusations surrounding one person. It is also about the silence left behind after a violent series of events, about families forced to rebuild their lives around an absence, and about communities trying to understand how 3 separate tragedies could unfold in such a short period of time. In October 2024, Ontario found itself facing a case that seemed to move faster than anyone could process. One investigation became connected to another. One community's shock became another community's fear. Toronto, Niagara region, and Hamilton were no longer separate locations on a map. They became linked chapters in a disturbing investigation that would capture public attention across Canada. For investigators, the days following the discoveries were filled with questions that had no immediate answers. Each crime scene represented not only a search for evidence, but also a search for meaning. What brought these events together? Why these victims? What circumstances created a chain of violence that appeared to unfold within such a narrow window of time? Those questions would become the center of the investigation. But behind every police report, every piece of evidence, and every courtroom document were people who had lost someone they loved. For the families of the victims, there was no distance between headlines and reality. They were not watching a mystery unfold from the outside. They were living inside the consequences. A normal day had transformed into a moment that divided their lives into before and after. Before the tragedy, there were conversations, routines, plans, and ordinary memories. Afterward, there were unanswered phone calls, empty rooms, and the painful process of accepting that someone who had been part of their world was suddenly gone. That is often the part of true crime stories that disappears beneath the investigation. The focus naturally turns toward the suspect, the evidence, and the legal process. But the victims were never just names connected to a case. They were people with histories, relationships, dreams, and futures that were interrupted. As authorities continued examining the events, the public searched for explanations. Many wondered how someone could allegedly become connected to multiple deaths in different places within only a few days. The idea of a person moving between communities while investigators were still trying to understand what had happened created a sense of fear. It raised uncomfortable questions about warning signs. Could something have been noticed earlier? Could someone have recognized a pattern before it became a tragedy? These are questions that often appear after violent crimes. They come from a natural human desire to find a point where the outcome could have been changed. People look backward, searching through moments, decisions, and interactions, hoping there was a signal hidden somewhere. But investigations rarely unfold with the clarity that comes afterward. At the beginning, officers do not have the complete picture. They only have fragments: a phone call, a witness statement, a location, a piece of evidence, a timeline that slowly begins to take shape. The challenge is connecting those fragments before more harm occurs. In the Sabrina Kaldhar case, investigators from different jurisdictions had to work together across multiple regions. When crimes cross boundaries, cooperation becomes essential. Different police services must share information, compare timelines, and determine whether separate incidents are actually connected. A case that begins in one city can quickly become something much larger. The investigation also brought attention to the complexity of understanding violent behavior. When someone is accused of committing extreme acts, people often search for a simple explanation. They want one reason, one moment, one answer that explains everything. But human behavior is rarely that simple. The questions surrounding motive can be among the most difficult parts of any criminal investigation. Was there a personal conflict? Was there a psychological crisis? Was there a pattern that investigators had not yet uncovered? Those questions are not answered by assumptions. They require evidence. And that is why the legal process exists. In a criminal case, accusations are only the beginning. Investigators may believe they have identified a suspect, but the justice system requires proof. Evidence must be presented. Arguments must be examined. Facts must be tested. For the accused, the courtroom becomes the place where the allegations are challenged. For victims' families, the courtroom can represent something different. It can be a place where they hope to finally understand what happened. It can be a place where memories are revisited and painful details are brought into the open. Justice does not erase loss. A conviction cannot bring someone back. A sentence cannot undo the moment a family received devastating news. But accountability matters because society depends on the idea that violence has consequences. Cases like this also force communities to confront difficult conversations about prevention. How do we identify someone who may become dangerous? How do we balance public safety with individual rights? How do law enforcement agencies respond quickly when information comes from different locations? There are no easy answers. Every investigation teaches something. Every tragedy reveals areas where systems can improve. Sometimes those lessons involve communication between agencies. Sometimes they involve support services, awareness, or recognizing signs of escalating danger. But the most important lesson remains the same. Behind every case file are human beings. The victims are the heart of the story. Their lives should not be remembered only through the circumstances of their deaths. They existed beyond the tragedy. They had families who loved them, friends who remembered them, and moments that mattered. A person's final moments should never become the only story told about them. As the case continued through the justice system, the communities affected by the events faced the difficult process of moving forward. Moving forward does not mean forgetting. It means learning how to carry the memory of what happened while continuing to live. For some people, healing comes slowly. For others, the pain remains connected to ordinary moments. A familiar street, a date on the calendar, a place that suddenly brings everything back. Loss has a way of appearing unexpectedly. A song, a photograph, a simple memory. The world continues moving, but for those who lost someone, time often feels different. The Sabrina Kaldhar case became one of the most discussed criminal investigations in Canada in 2024 because of its shocking timeline and the questions it created. But when the attention fades and the headlines disappear, the impact remains with those closest to the victims. The investigation may eventually answer questions about what happened. The courts may determine responsibility. But for the families left behind, the story is not only about what occurred during those few days in October. It is about everything that existed before. The lives that were lived, the memories that remain, the people who were loved, and the reminder that behind every crime statistic is a person whose absence changes the world around them forever. The case of Sabrina Kaldhar leaves behind difficult questions about violence, accountability, and human behavior. But perhaps the most important question is not only why these events happened. It is how we remember those who were lost. Because in the end, every investigation has an ending. Every courtroom eventually goes quiet. Every headline eventually disappears. But the lives affected by tragedy continue long after the cameras leave.